You're listening to Faith in Action. I'm your host, Matthew Nowlin.
And I'm Sean Graham.
We lead Conservative Christians of Tennessee, and we are thankful you're joining us today. Conservative Christians of Tennessee exists to analyze political policy and politicians in Tennessee, and all from a conservative Christian worldview. We want to glorify God by helping you to glorify God, so please don't hesitate to send us questions and comments via email. You can reach me directly by emailing matthew@tnchristian.com.
Or Sean, SHAWN, @tnchristian.com.
Our scriptures for today are from Ezra, the first chapter, verses 1 through 3. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. Listeners, we want to pause for a moment and offer the proper praise to the Lord for what is really unmerited mercy on our nation. Sean and I have spent more time than we can remember rejoicing and laughing at the failures of foolishness and wickedness in America. We rejoice every time there are ungodly rules and policies from the old administration that just evaporate to the chorus of demonic wails by the traditional media. With the election of Donald J. Trump as president again, Christians have clearly seen the irrefutable reason for why we vote. The simple election of President Trump has changed many issues that affected all the people of our lands. If you want to join us in this celebration, just pick a victory. America has now outlawed child gender mutilation. America has finally come to assist in disaster relief for the people of North Carolina. Astronauts are being rescued from space. Abortion mills are being federally defunded. A vice president just picked up a sign and publicly marched for life. There are so many more ways we could spend this entire show on things that have happened that are different now than they were 2 weeks ago. For this, we should bring praises. This administration will not always do things we love, but when they do, we should dance like David. If you hear all this winning and still refuse to get involved in politics, or if you're a pastor too afraid to talk about politics, please learn from this moment. Elections show that we as Christians are able to love our neighbors. If you voted for Trump, you caused the release of religiously oppressed pro-lifers like Paul Vaughn of Tennessee. The former administration used the Evil Face Act and the full weight of the U.S. judicial system against Paul to detain him for protesting the murder of innocent babies. Praise the Lord, Paul Vaughn is pardoned. If you voted, you need to be rejoicing with us. If you still don't see the need to vote, we humbly offer that your love for your neighbor may be hollow words. Our guest today, Joe Rigney, is an assistant fellow of theology at New St. Andrews and a pastor at Christ Church Moscow. Guys, his book, Emotional Sabotage, it's making its way through a lot of leadership circles. Joe, welcome to Faith in Action. We're excited to have you on.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys.
Before we go any further, you don't know this about me. I used to be an Assembly of God boy, and I went to North Central Bible College. So I used to be very, very close to where you were at in Minneapolis for a while. Right. And Sean likes to write questions and say things that are designed to poke fun at me as a former Pentecostal. So the first question that he has for me is, how much dancing have you been doing this week?
Right. Yeah, no, it's been a bit of a remarkable thing. I think how good the policy's been in terms of executive orders, especially, but also how smart the politics has been.
Yes.
Whatever's going on with Trump 2.0 has leveled up in both dimensions and bodes well, I think, for the next 4 years. Like you said, I think there will be times where he does things and the administration does things we're not fans of and that we would need to oppose. But so far, it's just been win after win after win. And I do think that the Christians who voted for him are now, like it, even in a week, it's vindication for that was a wise, moral, and strategic political choice to put him back in office. And yeah, I'm not tired of winning yet. I would like to keep winning, actually.
That's right. I'd love to drag David French out and make him take a Eat Crow tour over this.
Yeah, and I think that the contrast there is remarkable. For example, if a Democratic administration is in office, guys like that will tend to look for the smallest thread of something good in order to praise it and kind of downplay all of the bad. It doesn't ever work the other way, right? Like there would be plenty of places where squishy Christians never Trumpers could say, well, I didn't vote for him and I think he's terrible. But man, this is a great policy. I'm really glad he's doing this. And they just can't bring themselves to do it. It would be too humbling. I think they also know that if they did, they would get lots of blowback of, well, no thanks to you. Instead, we'd have expanded transgender stuff, and we'd have expanded abortion access, and we'd have expanded legal immigration. All of these things would be much, much worse. Had Christians listened to you, that's where our nation would be. And instead, we actually decided we're going to honor God and love our neighbor by picking the best choice on offer, and we're being vindicated in that.
The topic of your book, Emotional Sabotage, is essentially empathy, and you argue against letting empathy control our decisions as leaders, control our decisions as businessmen, as politicians, as pastors, as parents, et cetera, et cetera. I want to come back to what empathy is in a minute, but how have the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration passed an empathy test, if you would give it?
Yeah, I think I Don't Really Care, Margaret is a great example of passing the sober-minded test, which resists the manipulations of untethered empathy. And that's really the issue. So, in Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, I talk about the dangers of empathy. I actually have a sequel/prequel releasing in the next month called The Sin of Empathy. I've been working on this for 7 or 8 years now. You say something like the sin of empathy, and people's ears kind of go, wait, what? I don't have a category for that. Yeah, and I go, I know, that's the problem. You have a category for the sin of anger, even though anger could be a good thing. You have a category for the sin of fear, even though fear is appropriate in its place. But you don't have a category for the sin of empathy. It's an unalloyed good, which therefore means it's the sort of thing that the devil likes to hide evil things under. It's a great hiding place for all sorts of destructive tendencies, temptations, and sins. And I think that's how empathy has functioned, especially in the modern world and in the last decade in particular, because it becomes a kind of steering wheel by which victims, oppressed classes, and that's real or imagined victims, that's not really the point, but that begins to set the agenda for the entire community, whether it's a church.
And how does it do that? What is your definition of empathy?
Yeah, so at a base level, empathy is just emotion sharing. So if you feel sad, I feel sad. If you feel happy, I feel happy. And so at one level, you go, well, that sounds pretty biblical, right? Weep with those who weep, rejoice with those who rejoice. And that's right. That's true. The new book actually has a chapter called In Praise of Compassion. I'm not opposed to compassion, pity, empathy. All of these are good things. But because they're good things, they can be twisted and corrupted when they become ungoverned, untethered from what is true and what is good. And so the way that happens is empathy becomes a kind of disguise and a power tool in the hands of the most immature, reactive, and sensitive members of a community. So feminism, I think, is a major contributor to this. The women are the more empathetic sex by God's design. That's why they're nurturers, they're life givers, they care, they're first responders in pain. But that means that if the people in charge of setting boundaries are highly empathetic, all it takes is someone presenting as a victim, as someone in need, as someone hurting, and all of a sudden what's true and good in the long run goes out the window in the face of mitigating the immediate feelings of the hurting. And so you begin to do all sorts of things that are destructive in the long run. You'll say things that aren't true in order to accommodate the lies of the hurting. And this is, I think, you could trace what goes on in our major cities with the indulgence of criminality, because these people have had hard lives. And so we're just going to let them do whatever they want. So law and order falls apart. People learn that the way to get your way is to just burn stuff down. So you see it in illegal immigration, where pictures of kids in cages, tearful migrants are used to justify keeping the borders open so that millions of able-bodied men can stream across it. And so there's bait and switches that happen. And then the apotheosis of it, of course, is the transgender stuff, in which deranged men are indulged in their fantasies because they're hurting, right? And so they're the victim class, they're the hurting class, and therefore we have to orient around them and do what they want, affirm, validate, don't question, don't challenge, don't resist. Why? Because our feelings and our emotions, our pity and our empathy have been awakened and have overridden what is actually true and what is actually good. And I think if you consider the last decade especially, every form of what has come to be called wokeness has running underneath it that dynamic. All of the ideological stuff, the cultural Marxism, the intersectionality, the critical theory, all of these are essentially ideological rationalizations for that emotional dynamic. That's the common thread. And so we're victims. Everything, we can do what we want. Victimhood confirms invulnerability. And so you get the victimhood Olympics. where groups compete to be the greatest victim in order to then have the power to dictate to everyone else how things are going to be. And I think the last administration was predicated on this fact. The present administration has recognized the game, and it's very clear that they're not going to continue to play it that way. Yes, have compassion, but also be sober-minded and do what's right.
And it's interesting. A lot of times when we have a public policy issue that we're talking about, we have two groups of people. We have the people that want facts, 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 and then we have the group of people that we have to explain things to on a very emotional level. It's almost like our society moving to an empathy-based society. If you're very rational and very logical, this just makes it incredibly easy to manipulate, doesn't it?
No, that's right. And I think people think, oh, this is going to be better. We need more empathy. You mentioned David French. Back when I was writing on this initially, I got French pressed in his Sunday newsletter because he said, this guy's saying there's empathy's bad. I think we need more empathy. And I'm saying, if you want more empathy, if you want to know where empathy is running rampant, look at the Middle East. Okay, because empathy for one group typically goes along with intense hatred and demonization of its opponent because it's just passions raging, and passions are dangerous. They're good. God gave them to us, but he gave them to us to be governed, and so they need to be tethered to something. And the thing is, we know this with every other passion. When it's fear and anger and desire, we know that there needs to be somebody's hand on the reins. If you let your desire just go unchecked, it's going to be bad. If you let your anger go unchecked, it's going to be bad. But all of a sudden, when it comes to pity or sympathy or compassion or empathy for the hurting, all of a sudden that same reality goes out the window, and people say, no, you can't have too much of this. You can't feel it too deeply, and you can't indulge it too much. And as a result, it becomes myopic. One of the more common examples of this, I think, is when it comes to like the abortion debate, where empathy for hurting mothers, young women who find themselves pregnant, and usually it's going to go to the most extreme and sometimes unusual circumstance, a woman who was raped by a family member. So you have incestuous rape, and people say, look at the empathy here. Don't you have empathy? And it's like, absolutely. What happened to this person is tragic, horrific, and the perpetrator needs to be executed. But the unborn child in the womb is not the perpetrator. Yeah, and so all of a sudden, it's empathy for the woman is used as a justification for dehumanization of her unborn child. And our feelings get going for her. And therefore, if she wants an abortion, we're going to let her have it and do everything we can to enable it. And so empathy for one means we ignore or we're indifferent to another. That's a classic example where empathy run amok short circuits our reasoning process, what's actually true and what's actually good.
Is that what empathy would have been originally explained as, though? Or is that a perversion of empathy?
The funny thing about this is actually, if you look at the history, the term empathy is actually, it's a recent term. Like it doesn't show up until like the early 20th century. And it comes from like art stuff. Originally, it was like, seeing a work of art and like projecting yourself into it to sort of feel something. And then it eventually kind of migrated. And I think what's happened, and you see this a lot in the literature, it's put forward over the last 50 to 70 years as an improvement upon sympathy. So sympathy is treated as like, that's an okay response to people in pain, but really you're just suffering with them. And there's a kind of emotional distance that sympathy preserves, meaning here's the person who's suffering. They're the one who's sinking in the quicksand, and I'm on the side and I've got one hand on a branch and I'm going to try to help pull them out. So sympathy preserves the distinction between the helper and the one who needs help. And I think that a lot of times people in pain, they don't like to be pitied. They don't want to have people feel sympathy. And so they want something more than that. Well, what's the more? It's like, well, I need you to jump in with both feet. If I'm in pain, you've got to totally jump in with both feet. And so empathy is this improvement. It's sympathy 2.0. It's a souped up, better, more loving response to those in pain. But what it actually ends up being is a steering wheel by which, those in who are hurting say, I need you to give me the keys to your emotional vehicle, and wherever I want to drive, you have to go with me. And if you don't, you're heartless, you're cruel.
That's really interesting. I can be sympathetic towards a lot of people simultaneously. I can only put myself in one person's shoes at a time. The idea that I'm transferring, that I'm understanding where they're coming from, this sort of epistemologically, like I'm looking at the world from their viewpoint. Right. But have you ever been in a driver's training class of any kind where they'll make the comment, that if you look, you're going to go where you look. So it's a leader that's looking to have a balanced, broadly expansive, really that's looking to represent the interests of a lot of people simultaneously, if they're empathetic, is that car not going to go right to where they're looking every time?
Yeah, it's select. Empathy acts like a spotlight. And so it targets certain people. And again, that's where you get the indifference to all others. Passions are powerful. And so when deep feeling for hurting people gets going, then it's hard to sort of put the brakes on it. And so, yeah, that's absolutely right, that it can become a kind of overwhelming, myopic spotlight that leads us to do things that we might kind of go, I don't know if this is the right thing, but I'll go along. And that's actually the way it works, is usually you have someone who's highly empathetic, feeling for the hurting, and then they become an advocate on their behalf. And then other nice people don't want to get in the way, right? They'll go along. They may have reservations. They may think, oh, I'm not sure that this is going to end well, but they'll go along with it because their passions are being drug along as well. And there it's fear of upsetting people, fear of being called names. I don't want people to think I'm heartless. And so those sort of emotions get going, and it's one big soup of feelings. And that's now running the show, as opposed to what is actually true, what is good, what does God say about this? All of those considerations are sort of thrown out the window. I got turned on to this partly by Edwin Friedman, a non-Christian rabbi, author, writing in the 90s, who wrote about the dangers of empathy. But the other guy who helped me see this really clearly was C.S. Lewis. Many of C.S. Lewis's works, especially The Great Divorce, are basically displaying this kind of emotional dynamic in what people use other people's pity as a steering wheel, as a form of emotional blackmail. So it was Lewis that helped me see that, mercy is great, but when mercy becomes untethered from justice, it becomes a man-eating weed, right? And it will destroy everything. And I think that's what you see. And I think in the present moment, we talked about the politics of it. Part of what the left, I think, is a little bit reeling in the face of this blitz, this throw everything at them and just they can't keep up, is that the old ways that they would keep conservatives and Republicans in line was largely by the fear of being called names and by empathy. You think about these hurting people and, we don't want to be thought of as heartless. And instead, you've got J.D. Vance saying, I don't care, Margaret, we're going to do what's right.
That's right.
You've got Tom Horman saying, you know who I feel compassion for? Laken Riley's family, who lost their daughter because an illegal immigrant was in this country and murdered her. So he's saying, I actually have compassion, but it's compassion directed towards those who are under my responsibility. And anything that threatens that, I'm going to act with decisive and clear action in order to protect and defend. And so compassion is actually there. He's not heartless. What he's saying is, my compassion is ordered and rightly governed for the people that I am responsible for. And that's an unusual thing. And I think the left is trying to figure out, oh no, the old steering wheels aren't working right now. What do we do?
Listeners, we're here today with Joe Rigney, and we're talking about his book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. Joe, in there, you've got a great line. You say, the pattern is abdication, idolatry, blame shifting. I think when you're talking about justice, the corruption of the judicial system, explain where we see this in the Bible and how this is playing out for everybody to see in the modern age.
Yeah, so that pattern is one that shows up repeatedly in the scriptures. The first instance is the most famous, Adam in the garden, who abdicates his responsibility. God told him to work and keep the garden, to set the perimeter, right? To be a guardian. He's supposed to do what priests do and guard the garden, the holy garden of God, from unclean encroachments. And then the serpent comes, questioning God's word, blaspheming his God, assaulting his wife, and Adam is there, but passive. He doesn't do anything. He just kind of drifts with the current, which then leads him to a second step. When you drift like that, eventually you take the big step. And the big step was when his wife offered him the fruit, he said, sure. And he chooses her over God. I'm going to listen to the voice of my wife, not the voice of my creator. And I'm going to do what she says, not what he says. And that's idolatry. So that his abdication leads to an idolatry. And then when God comes to call him to account and says, what have you done? He points his finger at his wife. The woman that you gave me, she did it. And so now we have blame shifting, excuse making. It wasn't my fault. And that pattern plays out again and again. Aaron at the golden calf, Saul in his mission to take out the Amalekites, which God sends him on. In each of these cases, it's the same pattern recurring. And this failed leadership, failed headship looks like. And I think you do see that where politicians regularly kind of get led by the nose. They just go along with stuff. Eventually, there's some big, gross injustice, gross abuse of power. And then when everybody says, what happened, guys? They just start pointing fingers every which direction. Well, it wasn't my fault. I was just standing here. Where did that golden calf come from? I don't know. I threw the gold in, out popped a calf. People started dancing. I started dancing. It was weird time. But you see that pattern again and again, rather than the alternative would be to take responsibility at every step along the way. When the threat comes and you're charged with guarding, are you taking responsibility for that guardianship role? Do you actually set the perimeter? When it comes time to the big choice, are you going to do what God says or what the world says, what a creature says? And then, especially if you've done something wrong, if you failed in some way, do you own it and say, you know what, I blew it and this was on me, and I'm not going to point fingers at anybody else. I'm actually going to take responsibility and accept consequences. Nowadays, politicians love to say, I take full responsibility, which means nothing is going to happen. And instead of, I'm going to take full responsibility, which means I'm firing a bunch of people or I'm resigning. And you never see that happen anymore because we don't actually expect politicians to do this. We don't expect them to lead this way. Instead, it's a permanent, cushy job where they can mess stuff up and nothing happens.
We have an understanding of what empathy is. What is the opposite of empathy?
I think what they mean by empathy is just kind of understanding. So like when you intellectually put yourself and kind of go, wow, that was weird. How did they get there? For example, and this is a good thing too, like live with your wife in an understanding way. Peter tells us to do that. What does that mean? It means kind of, what do things look like from her perspective? And that's absolutely, Christians should do that all the time. I do that all the time. But I don't then sort of hand the keys over and say, well, then, and whatever they understand to be the case must be true. Whatever they feel to be the case must be true, and I have to go along with it. That's not what the expectation is. What God, I think, expects is what I would call sober-mindedness first. And sober-mindedness is a kind of steady, clear-eyed stability that's ready to act with purpose, not be reactive, not emotional domino, but steady sober-mindedness. And what that does is it enables both curiosity, why did they act that way, and compassion. And so compassion, I think, and sympathy are the biblical terms for the virtue. It's what Christ was moved with compassion. And God tells us to have bowels of mercy, to feel deeply for people, but it's always on a leash. And the leash is love for God and what is true and what is good. That's the thing that we anchor ourselves to. And then once we're holding on for dear life, now we can look at people who are hurting and say, I want to actually help you, which may be actually doing something to displease you in this moment, because I can see from where I'm standing better than you can what the actual problem is. There's a great video, a comedy sketch with a woman and a man, and the woman is talking about how she's just in so much pain and everything hurts, and she's like, it hurts right up here above my eyes, and then the camera zooms out and there's a nail sticking out of her forehead, and her boyfriend or husband says, I think you have a nail sticking out of your head, and she said, it's not about the nail. It's not about the nail. I just wish you would, why do you always focus on the nail? It just hurts right here. And I can't even think straight. And she's just going on and on about the pain she's in. And he's looking at the nail, trying to decide whether to bring it up again. And finally, he just goes, that sounds really hard. And she goes, it is hard. Thank you for listening. And then leans in to give him a hug. And then he hits the nail and she, ow. And, it's a nail. It's not about the nail. And it's like this great comedic comic sketch. And this is actually what people do. Like it's funny because it's true where, hey, there's actually something we could do to fix this, but you don't want to hear about fixing it. You just want the feelings to be indulged. And to be honest, there's actually a place for this. Like I have a category. I'm a pastor. I have a category for sitting with someone and not necessarily offering solutions, but kind of like Job's friends after everything that happened to him came and they did okay for about 7 days. But at some point you do have to start saying, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do about this? What does God want us to do about this? And at that point, feelings are often not your friend. They can be deceptive. Our passions can lead us astray. Over and over in the Bible, the passions can lead us astray. And we think about that and go, yeah, well, sexual desire is a passion and it can lead us astray. The passion of pity, the passion of empathy can also lead you astray. You need to be alert to it. The danger's there just as much.
That is fantastic. I want our listeners to know where they can get your book. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on.
Good. So you're looking for the books. You've got Emotional Sabotage. You can go to emotionalsabotage.com. The new one's called The Sin of Empathy. You can pre-order that at canonpress.com. That will be releasing, I think, at the end of February. In terms of what I do, yes, I'm a college professor. I teach theology for freshmen at New St. Andrews. We're a Christian college in the Pacific Northwest in a little town called Moscow, Idaho. We want to raise up leaders who shape culture under the lordship of Christ. Our bookstore is called The Sword and the Shovel because we want to rebuild Christendom. We want to reestablish the Lordship of Christ in every sphere of life. So if you have a high school student, we'd love for you to consider checking out New St. Andrews. We're very affordable relative to other schools in the country. You don't have to worry about wokeness. And you're thinking about ministry. We're launching next fall a Master of Divinity program. Very affordable. Basically, every student gets a $15,000 scholarship so that the cost for them is only $5,000 in tuition per year, because we don't want our pastors going into debt in order to do the work that God's called them to do. And we want to train them up, send them out so that we have churches that worship God rightly. And then out of that robust worship, then you get the kingdom of God flowing forth in every area of society. And so that's our vision. And so check us out at nsa.edu.
Well, folks, that's going to do it for another episode of Faith in Action. We're thrilled that from now on we get to join you in Nashville, Memphis, all over Tennessee as we talk about more ways to put your faith into action. If you want to hear more on this or other topics from a Christian worldview, head on over to botradionetwork.com, search for Faith in Action. There we have links to 5 years of past shows. You can listen to a wide range of guests sharing their wisdom about current events that affect the state of Tennessee and our nation. And until next week, remember, the Lord shall reign forever and ever.